Hey everyone, hope all is well. My name is Myles Dyer and welcome to the Quest for Global Empathy. Today we are going to jump just straight into it. No long introduction, I'm sure you'll be very glad to hear that. I am joined by a good friend of mine from across the ocean in the United States of America. He is a political commentator and host of the podcast show The Humanist Report, Mike Figueredo. Dude, thanks for coming on the Quest for Global Empathy.
Thanks for the invite. I'm so glad that I feel so honored that you thought of me. Thank you.
No, definitely. And I'm just really looking forward to discussing everything from both sides of the Atlantic in the world of politics and beyond. We're both gamers, so I'm sure we'll talk a little bit about that as well.
Definitely.
I'm going to start off with a very foundational question, which is, how do you describe yourself politically?
Probably the easiest description I use is socialist, but that's kind of like the oversimplification. Like, I also describe myself as a humanist. Obviously, that's the name of my program. Also a pacifist. But socialist is probably the easiest descriptor because the core of my politics is, promoting labor rights, having workers own control of the means of production, and yeah, socialist basically, put simply.
I do find the labels an interesting discussion, not only within, for example, American politics, but how it differs on both sides of the ocean, because what might be regarded as extreme socialism are things that perhaps our conservative government over here supports, or at least currently seems to support. For example, a national health service. I've always wanted to move to the States. I've always described Americans as my kind of people because whenever I go over there, obviously these are all going to be generalizations. There are always exceptions to the rule, but I find Americans much more sociable, much more outgoing, optimistic. But I do think that over the last 10 years, there has been this kind of leveling between the UK and US in attitudes, which we can get into a bit later. But the one area of America that always concern me if I was to go out there is the healthcare system, if you can even call it that.
Yeah, the healthcare system in the United States has basically been a really huge priority for the left for decades. Our healthcare system is as bad as it's described by news, by people. Like, we're not being hyperbolic. It really is terrible. Not only is it inefficient, it's extremely confusing. You always have to reapply. And one thing that I'm so envious of is, of people who live in the United Kingdom and Canada, is they say they never think about healthcare. They never have to think about who they're going to go to if they get sick. They never have to consider whether or not their hospital is in network, something that a lot of people around the world don't even know what that means. But our healthcare system is absolutely atrocious. It really is. It's all about profit here. So it's not necessarily about whether or not you need care. It's about whether or not you can afford care. And even if you have health insurance and you think that in theory you're covered, you might not necessarily have the best insurance provider to where they will nickel and dime you, and they'll charge you out-of-pocket expenses that you weren't necessarily expecting. So American healthcare truly is like one of the worst, and it's consistently ranked one of the worst by the Commonwealth Fund. We ranked dead last again in their latest report from July. So it's awful, and really what I aspire to have is like a UK based system. Of course, no system is perfect. I know that there are some privately run hospitals in the UK, but overall, I want to remove the money making motive from healthcare, because I think that there's no way to actually have a system that is focused on healthcare if there is that perverse incentive. So it really is awful. And I love watching reactions from people around the world as they see like the cost of American healthcare, because it helps educate Americans about what we're missing out on, that people have such a huge reaction around the world when they see what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, I understand the fascination with our reaction, but it is out of complete horror. And I do think of people like Bernie Sanders who have really got the messaging to a T. We are, well, I say we, he says about America, we are the only major country on earth not to guarantee healthcare as a right. And he asks, why is that? And like posing the questions to people, because I talk often on this show a lot about exceptionalism within nation states. All countries have it. The UK loves flag waving. You know, we have the royal family, and we used to rule half the world, if that. And some or many of our government officials still seem to live in that bubble. But with that said, there are things that we can learn from other countries. You know, we should be looking afield, seeing what other countries are doing well, and bring that home. And then if there are things that we do well, we then actually emulate that to the rest of the world. But it seems that people aren't willing to do much self-reflection, and the fact that America is the only country to have a non-existent healthcare system is just continually confusing to me. But I think it is because is it meant to be like a third of the US economy, healthcare? It's like a massive portion. So
yeah, I'm not entirely sure how big it is, but it's absolutely, it's giant. And basically every single American is going to have some sort of a healthcare horror story, to where they needed, to go to the hospital, but the ambulance took them to a hospital that was out of network. So their insurance company wasn't, paying for any bills from a particular hospital. Even like myself, my dad passed away last year, right at the
sorry.
beginning of the pandemic before it hit. And my mom received bill after bill after bill for various, hospital stays, ambulance rides, all the way up into December. Like, he passed away in March, and she was still getting bills in total of like hundreds, over $100,000, probably not hundreds, but like maybe 90 to 100 plus $1,000. And the confusion is that she doesn't know if she has to pay these bills. Is she just receiving an itemized list of what the insurance companies are going to pay for? So it's a lot of horror mixed in with confusion and just overall cruelty. And I think that little by little, Americans are kind of waking up, thanks to individuals like Bernie Sanders, who really educated people about the fact that, hey, you're being taken advantage of. Other countries don't have to deal with this. This is unnecessarily cruel. And people are learning, but they still are really susceptible to fear mongering. So, when you explain healthcare being free at the point of service, Americans are really receptive to that message, but then they get other messages about how it's scary that they're going to lose their private insurance, and then they kind of move back in the other direction. So it's a constant information battle. And unfortunately, all of the really wealthy industries, like the healthcare industry, has the money. So that's why they're currently winning the messaging war. But I think that we are making some ground. And I just hope that, like, in my lifetime, we'll see Medicare for all, or a national healthcare system. Will it happen? I think possibly with newer generations. But by the time we get, Medicare for all, climate change will be the number one concern, or it already is the number one concern. But, we won't even be thinking about healthcare because of the array of issues that will bring about. So it's constant. It's an ongoing battle. And every single time I have the opportunity to radicalize someone on healthcare, and when I say radicalize, it's not radical at all, from your perspective, but
Right.
from my perspective, here in the United States, anytime I have the opportunity to radicalize someone, I try to do that. And usually you can just use their own stories about healthcare to radicalize them. Oh, you got a bill for $800 to ride an ambulance? Okay, yeah, let me explain to you why this doesn't actually have to happen, and other citizens around the globe don't deal with this. So, it's really frustrating, but it will continue to be an issue because, there have been solutions like the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, and that didn't actually do much to change the core of our healthcare system. I think that it was an improvement, but it was like a small band-aid over a gigantic gaping wound. And the Affordable Care Act helped me get healthcare because I'm self-employed as a YouTuber, so I don't have like some boss that offers me healthcare. So I was able to like go on the exchanges and purchase healthcare, and I'm paying like, I think, a total of $1,700 a month between me and my husband for healthcare, and it's the cheapest plan that I could find.
Oh my goodness.
And it's an improvement because I have healthcare, but at the same time, it's like, is it really that great? Americans don't really understand what the Affordable Care Act is. There's been, videos. I think it was Jimmy Kimmel, who did a show asking Americans, what do you prefer, Obamacare or the Affordable Care Act? They're the same thing. And, they'll talk about how, oh, well, I like the Affordable Care Act, and they'll give, a variety of reasons. So it's just, there's so much confusion. And I think that like these private insurance companies, they really seize on that confusion. They kind of prey on people's ignorance on this issue. And so it's a nonstop battle. But, I appreciate people like yourself and all of our Canadian, neighbors and whatnot who explain, hey, we have single payer here. We love it. If you ever took it away from us, we would absolutely go crazy. I remember watching Sicko, the documentary of Michael Moore, when I was like 19 years old. And that's what radicalized me. And he interviewed a scholar from the UK. And I believe he asked this person, like, what would happen if, British people lost their healthcare system, or if it became fully Americanized and privatized? And his response was, oh, people would riot in the streets. You can't take that away from them. They love their NHS. So, I long for the day when we have that type of a system here. I think that once we get it, it's going to be difficult for them to take it away from us. Although, privatization is something that is slow. It's like death by a thousand cuts. But I just want something better than this, because it's really awful.
Man, I mean, that cost that you just gave is just astonishing. And it's an example of how race to the bottom work, because when it comes to things like healthcare that you need, and you're saying, well, that's the best one you can get, that's what sort of conditions a population to accept things that are actually unacceptable. And again, it's why we need these political leaders to actually, point out, no, this isn't right. This doesn't have to be this way, and it should change. And what you were saying about the framing in the battle and the propaganda is one of the biggest issues. I agree, because as you mentioned, the NHS is free at the point of use, but far too often you hear critics say, but it's not free, you're having to pay higher taxes. And it's like, that's what free at the point of use is about. It's having that peace of mind. About 6 years ago, I had a head injury, got taken by an ambulance to a hospital in London from work, glued my head back together, sent me off. I had a few appointments with a GP, had a head scan, and then I got sent to some doctors, and it was a long process. It didn't cost me anything in the moment, and that was a peace of mind that I needed, because when you're recovering from an illness or going through something, you don't want to be dealing with questions of, well, what's this going to cost me? Because again, in Bernie's campaign, he often talked a lot about cases with people with diabetes and insulin, where they would be splitting their prescription, their doses. And I think he even took people over the border to Canada, like it was an hour or two, where they could get it for like a tenth of the price or something like that. And really exposing the absurdities of such a system. But you mentioned that the key word there, that it's a cruel system. And so when we look at a lot of these key political issues, we do see a lot of cruelty in our politics. The us versus them is constantly brought up because it's a good way to divide us. I do want to go into sort of your backstory of how you got into creating the Humanist Report and what sparked that, and maybe that will be an answer in part to the question I'm about to ask you now, which is, when it comes to dealing with cruelty, how do you think we take it head on? Because some people, when they do try and take it head on, behave in ways that are perceived as cruel to the people that they believe are being cruel.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, for me, I started the Humanist Report kind of half serious about it. I wasn't necessarily sure that I wanted to like make a podcast that would go anywhere, but I wanted to just get a little bit of public speaking experience because I was in a PhD program. I really wanted to be a teacher. I wanted to teach political science, in particular at the community college level, even if I wouldn't make a lot of money. Like my community college professors really had like this profound impact on me as like a poor kid growing up, being the first in my family to go to college. So I wanted to like try to help people. So I thought I should get some public speaking experience, and I'll start the Humanist Report, and it'll kind of give me a little bit of an outlet to talk about politics. And yeah, it was the perfect storm. I don't know that I was doing anything particularly unique, but it was, at the start of Bernie Sanders' 2016 presidential campaign, and there wasn't a lot of enthusiasm for Bernie in the mainstream media. So people were really flocking to these online YouTube channels and groups to find out more information about Bernie Sanders. And I was fascinated with it. So, it kind of blew up. But I tried to create a politics based on not cruelty, but like human empathy. And really, one thing that kind of gave me a lot of my political perspective is Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot video, where he kind of talks about how fragile the world is. And if you look at that pale blue dot from space, every single war that's been fought, every tear that's been shed has been right there. And so when you kind of step back and you don't think about this from a country or a state level or a province level, and you think about it from the human level, we're all the same. If we all see each other as human beings and not as the other, I think that the cruelty would dissipate. But I feel like, as human beings, we all have a little bit of cruelness in us. We all have negative characteristics. It's just a matter of like trying to change our perspective. And so that's really where what I try to do with the Humanist Report, try to see things from the perspective of we're all human beings throughout the world. I may not know anyone in South Sudan, but they suffer just like I do. They have the same aspirations like I do. And I think that we need to do everything in our power to help other human beings in the world. This is like, right now when it comes to climate change, we're all in this together. And that sounds corny and cliche because it is, but it's true. If we don't actually bind together, this species is not long for this planet. So, that's kind of where I come from. I try to minimize the cruelty, although admittedly, I think I could be cruel myself, with with the best intentions, right? Like I don't want to do that, but in trying to get across a point that I think is good, sometimes I could be a little bit crass and possibly mean-spirited. But, part of humanism, I think, is acknowledging that human beings are really flawed individuals. Every single one of us is flawed. Even the most well put together person who seems like they have everything going for them, they have issues, they have insecurities. So it's just like acknowledging the fragility of human life and the complexity of our emotions, and just trying to, I don't know, bring people together. And it's a little bit utopian in a way, because it's like, hey, why can't we all just like hold hands and sing Kumbaya? And that's not necessarily realistic, but trying to get us to some version of that, some flawed human version of that is kind of like, that's kind of the goal for me. And you can't do much as a podcast host, but if you could put something out there that's positive, that has an influence on someone, then I think that's a win for me, right? At the end of the day.
I think you can do lots as a podcast host. I mean, it was interesting you mentioned that Bernie Sanders' 2016 campaign was what really got you on board, because that's how I discovered you, and it was a time that I started doing a lot of political videos, and the traction it was getting I found very interesting, because in the past when I'd done videos regarding Obama, I did a video about how the Mitt Romney Obama sort of choice was bad for democracy because of the surveillance state, the drone program, all these issues, and the amount of vitriol I got from Americans of why is this British guy butting in? Why doesn't he keep to his own? And I would explain that, well, firstly, I love the American people and I want them to do well, but I think more relevant is the fact that what America does influences what the UK does, because we follow you into war. More recently, we leave war zones with you. You lead the way, and so it is all very, very important. However, in 2016, the love was huge, because I think with Bernie's campaign about looking to other countries and taking what they do well, and then obviously teaching them things that America does well, I think that mindset made people a lot more open-minded, and there was this real sense of, wow, this British guy knows a lot about our system. Clearly this is important. Like, this clearly has a global thing. And the Carl Sagan Pale Blue Dot thing you mentioned, I totally agree with you. I absolutely love that piece. And funny enough, my band, we got a new release coming out soon, and there is a track on it that's got a few quotes, and it's got a bit about the pale blue dot in it because, yeah, it's so powerful. And I was looking up just now a quote I was trying to remember, and it was, I don't know if I can bring it up here on share screen, but it was from Edgar Mitchell, the sixth man to walk on the moon. And in 1974, speaking of his spaceflight, the Apollo 14 astronaut told People magazine, "You develop an instant global consciousness, a people orientation, an intense dissatisfaction with the state of the world, and a compulsion to do something about it. From out there on the moon, international politics looks so petty. You want to grab a politician by the scruff of the neck and drag him 250,000 miles out and say, 'Look at that, you son of a bitch.'" And that quote has always stayed with me because I think it's called like the overture effect, or I've probably butchered it, but it is this thing about when you go out into space and, as you say, see it as just this little marble in a complete void. It does change you, because even though you see pictures of the Earth, it's not the same as actually being out there. Like, the blackness of space really looks black compared to when you see it on a screen. And this is a bit of a weird tangent to take the conversation, but no doubt will relate to a lot of the other things we'll be discussing. But more recently, when we saw Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos take their... Well, only Jeff Bezos had more of a phallic-shaped rocket into space. Richard Branson had more of a cool-looking one. I'll give him that. But
I'm glad you noticed that too. I could not unsee that.
Yeah. It was interesting marketing that I'm sure there might have been some intention behind it. But the thing I was looking out for with both of them was the impact of seeing the Earth like that. And I remember when Richard Branson came back to the Earth and he spoke on stage, he was like rushing through his words and he kept on saying, so sorry, I'm just trying to take it all in. And I feel it doesn't matter how much money you're worth or how disconnected you could argue they are from mainstream society because of their wealth and power, that maybe this could change them for the better. And with Jeff Bezos, I think he talked... It was actually the first time I think I've ever heard him speak. I've never actually seen him speak before, just seen him reported on. He seems quite robotic and very, not deadpan, but just very tinny in his thoughts. And, you know, there's nothing wrong with that. Different people speak in different ways. And he's clearly successful at what he does. But it was interesting where he was looking at ahead of, we need to protect this planet. And look, I'm not a Jeff Bezos fan for a million different reasons, but there's a part of me that feels, I wonder if that impact could really change people like him. But saying it, once he's back to Earth, he'll be back in the system that has got him to where he is. And I think one of the ideas he suggested was, which when he first mentioned it, I thought that's a really good idea, and then I realized how stupid it was. But he says we basically need to take all the polluting industries and take them into outer space and keep Earth as a residential area. Now, I do think the idea of having industry in outer space and having Earth as residential is a smart plan. But the idea of, like, we need to take our polluting industries into outer space, like how much pollution would that cause to get it all up there? It really shows you how status quo we are when we're looking to the future. And I don't mean to go off another tangent, but do you know of the guy Jacques Fresco, who was the founder of the Venus Project? I don't know if you've ever heard of him. He was featured in a couple of documentaries like the Zeitgeist Movement and that. But he was a man that was an industrial engineer. I think he met Einstein when he was a kid. Like he lived till he was 103, I'm going to say.
Wow.
But I actually got to meet him when he was 96. I went to see my parents who were in Boston for a few years. And it was my birthday, and they said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, I want to go to Florida, Venus, Florida, in the middle of this swampland, and go visit this guy that did these weekend tours of his self-sustained home he lived in, and he had all these amazing designs. And my dad went with me, which I was glad, because at that point I didn't want to go. I didn't think I was naive, but I at least wanted someone else there for like a second opinion to get their thoughts on it. And Jacques Fresco was on the Larry King show in 1974. It was in the 70s, and this was a time where when you were on a broadcast show and you wanted to show images, you had to hold them up to the camera. There was no cutaways. And this is a guy that had designed aircraft that when they crash, they eject the fuel because what often kills people isn't the impact, it's the burning of the fuel on the plane. He designed toilets that when you flush them, it uses the wastage from the sink because, it's crazy to think that we use clean drinking water, to flush our feces and waste down. It's just ridiculous. And he designed, vehicles with magnetic bumpers so they couldn't collide. But even in the 70s, he was talking about we need automated transport. If a car can tell you the oil needs changing, why can't it then change the oil? So he was very much ahead of his time in the 70s. And even to the day he died, he was still working on designs. He created these like canals that come out from the sea, and it's like a greenhouse, so that when the sun makes the water evaporate, it gets rid of the salt, and then it cleans the water from the sea. So like he designed really big things in circular cities. And the reason I bring this up is because the point he made again and again about value systems is we as humans are products of our environment. Now, even though that nature, it's the question of nature-nurture, the nurturing that takes place is informed by our environment as well. And he says that when you see, movies in space of, fighting and, spaceships with lasers, that is us projecting our current value systems into the future. And there were a few examples where there were sci-fi entertainment entities like Star Trek, where they actually had futuristic values as well, like a resource-based economy. Because when you look at Terminator and the fear of robots, that's because in the current day, in our current system, we have an anxiety to the idea of being replaced by robots, because then you have no purchasing power, you have no safety net to fall into, and we're constantly as human beings fighting over scarcity. Whereas he argued, if we have that technology that is distributed and is not in the hands of a few wealthy individuals, it will democratize everything, whether it's power in terms of energy or information, as we're seeing with the internet, although there are battles over what controls it. But what we see when we look at future value, sci-fi movies and that, is it's using our current value system on the future. And so what you were saying about striving for, not utopia, but for a better world, people often resist it because they don't feel things can get any better. And that was a really, really long train of thought, but I really am interested to hear your thoughts on people like Jeff Bezos, Richard Branson, because they are seen in many ways as enemies to progress. But is there any hope that they could actually be a part of the solution?
I am a little bit too cynical to think that they could be part of the solution, but if there's some flip of a switch that went off in, Jeff Bezos' head when he saw Earth from space, maybe he can use his enormous influence and wealth to do something. But I kind of feel like there's the thing with a lot of these billionaires who really are part of the new space race is that there's this skepticism that I think is warranted among the public, and that they're not necessarily doing this for altruistic reasons. Like back when we saw the moon landing, like we weren't alive then, but it was a victory for humanity. It wasn't, hey, the Americans beat the Soviets. It was, hey, this is what our species accomplished. This is huge. But like when it comes to, Richard Branson and Jeff Bezos, I don't feel that way. Like it feels like this is a victory for them. This shows what wealth can accomplish. And on top of that, it feels like if they do see how fragile the world is, they don't necessarily care so much about solutions for most people. It's about, well, how do we build some sort of a life ship for ourselves? I mean, that's part of what I see with like Elon Musk, for example, and his ambitions to go to Mars. I think that going to Mars for the first time, like having a human being set foot on Mars, would be really important for the human race to see. I think it would kind of change our perspective, at least for a limited amount of time. I mean, as you were talking about, like that quote from the sixth man to walk on the moon, that was an era where the EPA was created in the United States. Like we started to really acknowledge, the importance of our entire planet. We kind of, for the first time, I think, in our species, there was this feeling of like global, not really unity, but this awareness that, we're all kind of like, we're the same. Like we're all on this small, tiny little rock floating through space. So I think that Mars could potentially do that. But the issue that I have with, the private space race is that I don't necessarily view elites as looking for solutions to like stop global anthropogenic climate change. As Jeff Bezos said, like he, that statement that he said sounded kind of interesting, but then stupid as you thought about it.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of had the same response, right? It's like, okay, well, good, he wants solutions, but then you think, wait, that doesn't even make sense. Like, how does that? So it's like, I feel like the extent to which that will catalyze some sort of awakening in them is going to be limited. But I hope that I'm wrong. I think that the cynicism in me has kind of overtaken a lot of things. I hope that I'm wrong. I hope that it makes them see the world for what it is and the beauty in it. But I think that the right people have to see this. Like we need to take the fossil fuel executives, we need to take the 100 corporations that emit 70% of global greenhouse gas emissions up on a spaceship, let them see the planet and how fragile it is. So I don't know, I see this as like their way of doing space tourism and profiting off of it. I don't see this as them trying to advance the human race, which really seemed to be the case when we tried to put human beings on the moon and successfully pulled it off. So I do appreciate this like push for awareness of like Earth and what we're living on. Like we kind of don't think about it. Like, we log on to Twitter, we play video games, but we don't think about how crazy it is that we're living on a marble, like a small marble in this gigantic, infinite, vastness of space. And that's really crazy. And like we think about the borders that we've constructed and how, some people are really hell-bent on protecting those imaginary borders that we created. And it's just, I think that if we changed our perspective, things would change a little bit. It's, I don't know. This is why I consider myself a humanist, because I kind of had like my political development when I was really addicted to like everything, astronomy related. Like, that was when the Universe series came out on History Channel. That was when I think Cosmos came out, with Neil deGrasse Tyson. So, my interest in space kind of like manifested at the time where I was developing more politically. So, I want people to have like this globalist, for lack of a better word, even though that has negative connotations. I want people to have a global view of the world and not just be, so American centric or, centric towards their state. Like I want to change politics in that way, but it's tough. And I say this with the awareness, knowing that I only talk about American politics usually because this affects me directly. So it's hard. Like my thoughts are a little bit jumbled on this. But anything that I can like extract hopium from, even if it's maybe like a private space race, I guess I'll take it at this point in time when there's not much to be hopeful about, if that makes sense. I don't know.
I'm with you on that. And I mean, another thing I found interesting over the years is people like Elon Musk. I'm very conflicted with him. I think there's a lot of great things about him, but I think there's also things that aren't so great. But I feel in order to be an individual that produces a product or really threatens the current way of doing things, so when he's coming out with these wall batteries that, will really upset the fossil fuel industry, he's created these roof tiles that are solar powered, and I believe they got a lifetime warranty, and that they're cheaper than regular roof tiles. I mean, this is what he's striving for, and if he does it, it would be absolutely incredible. But for an individual to have that ambition and to not be fearful of the powers that be or competing industries that would do a lot of stuff, to silence it, we just need to think of people like Nikola Tesla. They have to be a bit of an asshole, like I feel that I always think about it with Julian Assange. Julian Assange, I've always had huge respect for with the things he's done, but there's no doubt that he has problematic things with his personal life, and that there's certain choices he's made that are questionable. But that's because human beings are very complicated. But I do feel that when you get to those individuals that have really put their head above the parapet, that's where you've got sort of a double-edged sword with those strengths. Like, their biggest strengths can also be their biggest weaknesses. And I also think that's why in politics you get some really, really odious individuals, because politics is a power game. So if you want people that are going to wield power, they're sometimes going to wield it in ways or have traits that you feel aren't what most people associate as being acceptable.
Yeah, I agree with that. It's why, like, with the Elon Musk solutions that he's proposing, this is why you kind of see, even with left-wing politicians in the United States, like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, like, their solution to climate change isn't necessarily to overthrow capitalism, even though that may be what they want to do. Their solution is kind of like respond to the capitalists or the mess that the capitalist system created with a different kind of capitalist investment in, clean, green, renewable technology, wind, solar, hydro. They're not necessarily talking about seizing the means of production here and having workers take over. They're talking about trying to make sure that these private enterprises, they have an incentive to, actually manufacture things that aren't going to destroy the planet, because we've been using our planet's resources endlessly to our own means and destroying the planet as a result. So, we don't necessarily have time to come up with this like really anti-capitalist, altruistic approach. We just have to do what's the quickest. And I think something like a Green New Deal, like having the U.S. government invest and other countries around the world invest in, climate-friendly technology, so that way that's where all the money is at. That's probably the most realistic solution, which is why I do agree with you. Like, Elon Musk, he is a douchebag. He abuses his workers, exploits them, force them to work during a pandemic. But at the same time, if he's able to do things that make the market kind of gravitate towards climate-friendly things like solar panels, I think that is a net positive. So like you said, it's a double-edged sword, right? I don't believe that anyone is like 100% bad or 100% good. I think it's usually a mixture. You could argue that some people like Jeff Bezos are probably mostly bad, but I think usually it's a mixture, right? Some people, it's like, that's a more of a philosophical conversation. Like, how bad is Jeffrey Dahmer? 99.99% sure. But, people are complicated. And honestly, at this point in time, I'm kind of like, let's do whatever we can. Anyone who wants to make a difference as it relates to climate change, even if it's minimal, I think that's valuable, because we really don't have time to be choosy. When it comes to things like this, especially given the gravity of like the IPCC report that was just released last month, we don't have time to be choosy. We'll have an imperfect coalition of misfits try to do their best, and I'm all for it. Whatever gets the job done and saves the planet, if it's salvageable, at this point in time, and I think it is. But future generations probably are gonna still have to deal with quite a bit. I think towards the end of our lives, when we're older, I don't know what we're gonna see, and it's a little bit scary. So I don't know. Again, I feel like my thoughts are super jumbled here, but it's such a big topic that it's hard to like wrap your head around. It's hard to be concise here.
No, definitely. And this is, I think, episode 10 of this podcast, and every one I do, I always reflect on the podcast afterwards, and I always feel that I've been very jumbled, but I realise it is because that's the nature of this podcast. It's just train of thought conversation, and we'll just go from one thing to the other. So don't worry about it if you feel that you've not come with concise stuff. That's the reason it's a 2-hour conversation, because I always find in most of these, it's like the first half an hour, it feels like more of a traditional conversation or interview, because we are trained that when we normally have interviews where you've got like a 10-minute slot, you have sort of not rehearsed, but you know how to communicate points concisely because you've only got so much time to get it out there. Whereas in this, that will kind of be at the start, but then as we get more into it, it just opens up more and more. And I always find the second hour is like when we hit the sweet spot. But already we're dealing with so many concepts, man. This is awesome. The phrase I hear again and again is, I think it's one of these ones that you feel, is it just a cliche and overly used? But I do think it's true. Don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good, but that can sometimes be a cover up for don't strive for better things, because that's right. It's then how do you define perfect? Do you know? I remember Hillary Clinton in the campaign against Bernie Sanders was it about healthcare, saying it will never ever happen. It was like it's this pipe dream and stuff, and I found that incredibly depressing.
Yeah,
and I just find that it comes back to language and terminology. In all debates, the amount of times I hear the right wing over there talking about Venezuela and socialism and crony communism. Is it, what's the name of the QAnon Republican member of the House? Marjorie.
Oh, there's a couple. Marjorie Green, Lauren Boebert.
Green. Yeah, she comes up with phrases like, I'd love to take her political science courses. She comes up with, I think it was like called like corporate communism, or fascist communism. Like, oh man, it made my head hurt. But regardless of how absurd it is, language is powerful. And I studied psychology at university, and one of my favorite parts of the course was learning about language. Did bits on Chomsky and that, but it's the fact that on a surface level, we assume that language is all about your ability to communicate with each other. But actually, the majority of language is about how you communicate with yourself. It's your inner monologue. And so a really simple explanation would be, if you're someone that watches a news channel or reads a particular newspaper where every story is outrage, all in capital letters, everything is black and white, and that is where you get that's your main source of information, that isn't only going to influence the things that you believe from reading it, but it actually changes the way you think, because you start thinking with the words that you learn and that you're surrounded with. And so you start thinking in outrage in capital letters. Whereas if you're someone that diversifies your media sources, and there's never a perfect amount, there's always more that you can do, especially in the internet age where we're pretty much drowning in information, that will help mitigate those risks. But it's the thing that I've always said, which is nuance generally isn't very, very sexy. And the example I always give is, if you were to do a YouTube video on, let's say, immigration, the responsible thing would be to do a video like, here are 10 things about immigration, and some of them are going to be positive and some of them are going to be negative. But that is not going to do as well as doing, here are 10 good things about immigration, because the people that think immigration is good will go share it, going, yeah, look, these are 10 reasons why it's good. And the people that don't like it will share it and go, look what they think, this is all wrong. And then you could do a video on 10 reasons why immigration is bad, and it will have the flipped response. And it is a depressing reality about our current discourse, because I mean, I used to work for The Guardian for 2 years as a video strategist, and I developed their Comment is Free video series, which was their sort of log pieces. They'd already done the Comment is Free opinion pieces on their newspaper. I pitched and developed the video version, and I was playing that game a bit, because when it's about growing it, I was saying you could do, we were just having individuals, doing pieces to camera, posing questions that was really great. And I was like, but if you want to build it up, you could do one with, let's say, Ricky Gervais, who talks about animal cruelty and why he calls, anyone that kills animals the C word. And so you could have him talking about that. And then you would do one where you get someone that actually goes out there hunting, posing with photos of a dead elephant and saying why it's good for conservation. And, and arguably that's perhaps not actually a bad thing, but it is something that feeds into the idea of polarization. Mm-hmm. And the fact that there is this temptation, because we live in this attention economy, that what is the quickest way to get attention? It's to get the threat neurons in your brain firing off, and the way you're going to do it is not with nuance. How does that sort of play with the stuff that you do? Because as content creators, we're always tempted by it, and sometimes we will do stuff that is on the spectrum of clickbait. You know, I think it's very lazy to say, you know, you either do clickbait or you don't. No, there is a degree of clickbait with everything we do, because we are trying to grab people's attention to bring them to us so we can then speak to them and, you know, borrow their eyes and ears.
Yeah, I think that you really hit the nail on the head when you brought up the psychological aspect of media and how it changes the way that we think in a way, because it disallows nuance even in our brains. Like if we see nuance, we kind of have trained ourselves, depending on what media resources we watch, to kind of like recoil at that thought. And I've seen this firsthand as a content creator, where I'll create like what I think is maybe one of my best videos, where I'm really detailed, really nuanced. I kind of weigh out the pros and cons of something. And the last one I could remember was the impeachment video, where Donald Trump was being impeached for a second time. And, you know, I went through the history of impeachment, what could possibly happen, what happened before. And, you know, it was really disheartening to see some of the comments just go straight to the conclusion of, well, this is bad or this is good, when really what I wanted is to get them to think more deeply about this issue and think through the complexities of this and actually use nuance and not just think in a binary way of impeachment good, impeachment bad. And that's like one of many, many, you know, videos that I've done where I really, you know, because I cover the news, so I can't go in depth on every single story as much as I try, but there are some pieces where I work really hard on because it's an important, big topic and there's a lot of confusion. So I try to like clear up the confusion. And you know, you kind of see it firsthand. You see people not just refuse to think in a nuanced way, but they recoil at it because it goes against kind of like what they've been trained to believe, and it goes against the way that they think. And it's a cognitive dissonance that we all experience, myself included. Like I am the same way to a degree. And so what you said about clickbait is really, really important. I think that there is, well, I mean, some channels will really go like overboard with clickbait, but I think that there is a utility in trying to cater to an audience, but also give them what they need. It's like trying to, you know, trick a kid to eat their vegetables by, you know, saying you get a candy bar at the end of it or something, or you give them a candy bar and you switch out the broccoli, something like that. So what I'll try to do, if there's a really, really complex issue, and I know people aren't going to want to pay attention to it, like healthcare, for example, or climate change, which is something that I think everyone on left media is struggling with, because people don't really want to watch climate change videos. Either they're not interested in it, or they feel hopeless, so they don't want to hear the bad news about climate change. So what you try to do is you wrap it in a more entertaining package, seemingly, so they don't necessarily think it's going to be just about climate change and in depth. It's going to be about like some politician calling another politician stupid for something that they said about the climate change. So you kind of take that bombast and the sensationalism, and you present that as like what people think that they're getting. But when they click on the video, you address that, and then you move on to what you really want to talk about, which is this really complex thing that you're trying to sell to them. So, you know, you hook them in, and once you get them, it's a little bit of a bait and switch, and it could be disingenuous, but I think that trying to find creative ways to use clickbait against people to educate them is important. But that can be used in a nefarious way as well. Like, as you said, we're being drowned out in information, and so people can use that in a bad way as well. And it's just a matter of like trying to navigate this space, trying to reach people in a media atmosphere and in a political time of hyperpolarization, hyperskepticism. And that's really, really tricky. Like it's like trying to hit a moving target. You always have to be able to adapt and try to meet people where they are. And sometimes that's really, really tough, especially when you cover news daily like me, because I feel like, you know, it's hard to be creative. Like I see the news stories and I decide what I want to cover based on how important I think they are, based on what I think my audience is probably going to want to hear me talk about, hear my opinion on. But it's really, really difficult because, you know, you have to try to find a way to cut through the binary thinking. But in doing so, you're basically retraining people how to think, as you alluded to. You're basically trying to not only retrain the way that people think, but give them the skills to not allow media to kind of warp their views of the world. Like I try in a way to train people on media literacy, to teach them about what is good and bad media consumption, right? Acknowledge if somebody is clickbaity. Question our motivations, question my motivations, question why I'm saying the things that I'm saying, but also don't be so skeptical to where you think anyone is possibly a bad actor. If I say something where I praise Biden once, you think, oh, he must be getting paid by the DNC. Like finding that right balance and educating people is part of the process, but there's no perfect recipe to be successful. It's hard.
Yeah, I think the algorithm has helped it over the years with YouTube, because when they switched to like watch time being to be the what makes videos rank well on YouTube is important. I mean, I've worked in digital strategy the last 15 years for a lot of companies, and it used to be whatever had the most views would get the highest rankings on search results. And I was looking up now as you were speaking for a YouTuber from 2005, 2006. I can't find him, and it's really annoying me. And he was, I think it was something called like Ted Rusty or something. It was a really funny name. And he basically made these 10, 20-second videos of, the video was like, man gets blown away in a tornado. And you'd watch it and he'd go, oh, I don't even know what his friend was called. Like he'd say, oh, hey, and it was always the same guy. Hey, so-and-so, what you up to? And then it was literally like a pillow or a cutout going into the tornado. It was so fake. So it would do millions of views. It'd get so many dislikes because people clicked it thinking that's what it was. And it was always the top results. It was like man falls off ladder. So it's him climbing up a ladder, and then it cuts to him as a pillow figure falling off. And it was just funny because it was like anti-clickbait culture. But I then worked for an online broadcast company that became a YouTube network in, I'm going to say 2012, might have been a bit earlier. And we started bringing on YouTubers on board, and it was looking at monetization, what they were able to monetize on their channels. And it was when YouTube switched to attention, audience retention. So for those tuning into the podcast that don't know, what happens on YouTube now, it's just a very more advanced algorithm than when it was first started. When you upload a video, the only thing YouTube can judge your content on is previous content you've uploaded to know if you're a quality channel, but also what the metadata is. So if you do a video and you've got, I always say Justin Bieber as an example, but I know that's a really dated example now. But let's just stick with that. Or Miley Cyrus, although some people are going to say that's still kind of like not that new. But if it was like Miley Cyrus in the title, anyone searching Miley Cyrus might see your video and click it because you got clickbait title and go to your video. Now, in the old days, that would work because you've got the click, you've got the view, and that's it. But what YouTube brought in was audience retention, which is it starts at 100% on a graph, which is these are all the people that have come to your video. And then as the video goes along, it goes down as people are dropping off. And as content creators, I'm sure, Mike, you agree, it gets kind of depressing sometimes when you think, I was making a really good point there, and they missed it. Like they dropped off just before it. And it really makes you analyze the way you make videos. But the reason it was important was YouTube wanted to start rewarding good quality content. And so if I did a video that was nothing to do with Miley Cyrus, and I put her in the tags, in the description, in the title, in the thumbnail, people would click it, get to the video, and then they'd go, this is nothing to do with it, and then click off. And so your audience retention would drop from 100% to 10% very, very quickly. And so when you upload a video in the first 24 hours, although it's probably a lot quicker now, it just judges the metadata, so you might do quite well. But then when the audience retention scores comes in, it then goes, actually, no, this is really misguided information. It's not doing well. We're going to put it down the rankings. And so this YouTuber I mentioned, who made all this anti-clickbait content that was one of the biggest UK YouTube channels, actually one of the biggest YouTube channels in the world, his channel just imploded because people weren't spending a lot of time watching his content because they were clicking on it going, oh, this isn't what it is, and then would leave it, even though they had millions and millions of views. And so he wasn't able to monetize, and I think that was a part of him deciding not to do it anymore. But that part of the algorithm has improved things a lot, and as you say, you still need to lean into the things that grab people's attention. It's just that you have to make sure that once they're there, they then know what they've got. And it's why, in the first 10 seconds of a video, you should explain what they're watching. And then they'll, and sort of bring them along the journey. And it's why it's important to be a good storyteller and to make sure that people know what sort of rabbit hole they're going down with your content. But the other thing you mentioned was regarding, my mind has just slipped now. It was regarding media literacy. And you were saying how important it is that it's not just about what you're telling them, but making sure they know how to think about it. And it's a very cliche point I make again and again. Education should fundamentally not be about what to know, but how to know. Because far too often in schools, at universities, you are just learning to memorize information to then, as soon as you're in the exam hall, I remember just minutes before my exam, I'm still writing stuff down again and again to get it in my brain. And as soon as I get the exam paper, I turn it over, just vomit on the page all the info I've got, and then decide how I'm going to put it into an essay. That's not very, very helpful. But knowing how to think, and again, me and Mike probably going to sound like broken records constantly mentioning Bernie. But he's very good that when he talks about healthcare, he doesn't just say, we should have Medicare for all, or we shouldn't just have a government healthcare system. He says, why are we the only country not to guarantee healthcare as a right? So he puts the onus on the audience. And so there are people that wouldn't normally think about it, and instead of just saying, yeah, we need healthcare, they're thinking, actually, why are we? And it creates curiosity. And it's so that when you don't have the attention of those people, once they've watched your videos and have gone on elsewhere, you know that it's not just a dead end where they've just gone away with the info you've told them. They've actually gone away with a way of thinking that can then influence the decisions they make in future content consumption, and also behaviors they exhibit in society as a whole.
Yeah, and it's really important, to try to find a way to tie these really broad concepts and big topics to real world examples. So one thing that I like with regard to Bernie Sanders is he tries to bring in a lot of examples. So when he was running for president, he'd talk about healthcare, and you can cite statistics about the U.S. healthcare system until you're blue in the face, but unless you tie it to a real world example, people won't necessarily acknowledge how those numbers translate into affecting them personally. So he talked about how somebody lost, their child because they didn't have health insurance, and had they had a doctor, a primary care physician, had they gotten checked out, they would have been here today. So that also kind of goes into what we do on YouTube. If I talk just about climate change, it's really, really difficult to connect with the audience, because when people see numbers and graphs and they hear projections, they tune it out. So you have to try to entertain them and tell them a story at the same time. So for me, I find that videos on climate change do a lot better if I can actually make it concrete. So we talk about how this indigenous tribe, for example, in Brazil, they're losing their homes because of the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. And if you have a video of one of them sharing their experience, it really makes it feel more real, as opposed to just saying, hey, we're pumping lots and lots of CO2 into the atmosphere, more so than ever in human history. They can grapple with the implications of that, but you have to paint a picture. And so that's really the tricky part, because when you do this every day, like for me, I cover news stories every single day, usually 2 videos per day. You don't have much time to prepare. And when it comes to news, usually the first person who gets their video out is the first person who is successful. So assume you follow 10 leftist content creators who all talk about news, and there's a lot of overlap. The person who speaks about something first is the person who gets usually rewarded, and people might not necessarily want to tune in to watch somebody else talk about the same subject. So YouTube does create a lot of incentives that I think are difficult. For news, for example, I feel like the switch to watch time was a good move for the algorithm, but overall, it does change the way that you have to approach these topics. So I noticed, like, just for myself, I try to be much more concise. Usually, I just kind of like it's word vomit oftentimes. Like, if you watch some of my older videos, I kind of drone on. And now I realize I could have cut out like 4 minutes of that. But, you want to keep people engaged all the way through. You want to keep people informed and entertained all the way through. But at the same time, at the end of every single video that I put out, I want to, ask myself the question, like, what is the contribution here? And I don't do this every single time, but it's just something that I kind of have subconsciously in the back of my mind. Like, what's the contribution? What are they going to take away from this? What is the value of this video? And that's something that I feel like more creators need to think deeply about. It's easy to just go for what's going to get you views and clicks. Drama is going to get you views and clicks. If two YouTubers are fighting each other, oh, you're going to get all the views and clicks in the world. But at the end of the day, like, what is the point of doing any of this? Like, if you have a gigantic platform, I feel like you have a really unique opportunity and you should be trying to use that platform for good. And sometimes I fail, but ultimately my goal is to, like, stay the course and educate people and make sure that people are informed and entertained. And they're just like, they're trying to put something good into the universe. And if they take that away from my videos more often than not, then I feel like that's a success.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that, and I think it's a really good outlook to have of it. And it is very challenging because the landscape is always shifting, whether it's to do with what other content creators are doing, what drama is in the air. And as you were talking about the importance of discussing issues in ways that relate to people as opposed to just giving statistics, I think that's why like memes have become so popular online, because people have always liked cartoons in newspapers, but now seeing images that really summarize certain ideas. I was thinking on climate change, there was a cartoon of a load of people in a hall watching someone on a screen, and it's saying like, renewable energy, clean water, all this sort of stuff, and the people in the audience are saying, what if climate change is a hoax and we've now transformed our energy systems towards clean renewable energy for nothing? Like it's a really good piece. And actually more recently, I don't know if this is going to come up on the screen, this image I absolutely love. On Twitter, remember when you complained about climate activists blocking the roads, which is happening a lot in London at the moment, and you've just got this, which I think was in Germany. And I mean, this isn't even a cartoon, this is just
wow,
carnage. But that is why imagery and showing relatable examples is important, because there is a lot of complaints at the moment of protesters blocking roads. And I'm always thinking it's because people have no idea how bad infrastructure is going to get when flooding and more extreme weather conditions continue again and again. But at the same time, it also means there can be very appealing memes that are actually very misguided and look good, promote an idea that you've already got and, help with your cognitive dissonance or your biases, and so again, like with many things in life, things that can be used to an advantage can also be a disadvantage. And education's a difficult one, because I think also when we talk about like what it is to be intelligent, this is going to seem like quite an extreme sort of pivot on the topic, but when we look at things like people that commit terrorist atrocities, suicide bombers and that, people think, oh, is it just going to be like idiots with nothing going for them? And it's like, well, no, some of them are like doctors or, very well established people in certain fields in education. Like, you can be a very well educated person in a certain field or industry, and yet you have still been susceptible to propaganda or ideology. And so I feel that when it comes to a lot of these issues, it's about having critical thinking, not just about the topics at hand, but the ideology as well, which is why when there are conversations, for example, about religion, I always think that, these are important conversations about religious fundamentalism, but I don't talk about it as religious fundamentalism. I talk about it in terms of ideological fundamentalism. So there are fundamentalist capitalists who think that capitalism is the best thing that's ever been on the planet and nothing else will ever be better. Like, this is the final step in human endeavor, and you can't criticize it. Which goes back to the whole thing about nuance being like unsexy, which is, I'm someone who would like a resource-based economy, which is post-capitalism. I think it will happen once the monetary system collapses in the same way that information has really messed up the entertainment industry. We've got Bitcoin now as sort of this middle road to it. Eventually, technology is going to link up supply and demand directly, that it will be able to have computer systems that go, this is the pattern of consumption of energy or food, and this is what we need to produce, and we use it with renewable energy. Like, that is what I hope happens. But in the meantime, I'm someone who thinks markets are important, but you need a mixed economy. You need things to be kept in check with each other. And so you get people saying, oh, I'm against big government. And I'm like, well, what type of government? Because there are some things where, yeah, we don't need big government in terms of a surveillance state. But there are things that we need big government for, like, I don't know, public services like healthcare or the fire brigade. That there are things, but a lot of people aren't willing to have those conversations. I'm curious to know, in terms of mainstream American discourse, is the polarization, because they always talk about how the polarization is getting worse. Do you think that the internet is showing signs of being able to reverse this?
Honestly, I think the opposite is true. I think that the internet has exacerbated polarization, particularly when older generations got access to the internet and social media became widely available. Because, I mean, people who I know personally, who I've never heard them utter a political remark in their entire life, are all of a sudden experts on American politics, on a global pandemic. I think that this moment, honestly, is like the ultimate challenge for humanity, when in theory we should be smarter than ever, because we all have cell phones now. We have virtually unlimited information at our fingertips, but I feel like we're dumber than ever. I feel like we're more misinformed than ever. And so, when it comes to polarization in America and the internet, I think it kind of goes back to meme culture. As you said, memes are so powerful because they're concise, they're witty, they're snappy, they're humorous, and they're very, very shareable. So, a video debunking a meme that is wrong is going to not be as powerful as the meme itself, because you share it and you read it in 2 seconds. A video, that's going to take 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. So there is this incentive to spread misinformation online, and also, there's this incentive to not actually curate it better and remove this misinformation if you're Facebook, for example, because this information attracts eyeballs, and eyeballs attracts advertising dollars, and that's money. So, in terms of polarization, I feel like it's going to continue to get worse, because it's kind of like a snowball effect, right? It starts small and then it gets bigger and bigger. And you would think that something might emerge that brings us all together, but it's the opposite. So, for example, the pandemic, at the beginning of the pandemic, I thought maybe this is going to be that one thing that gets all of us to come together, because it's a pandemic. A virus isn't political. A virus wants to infect everyone, right? But the opposite happened, and it drove people further apart, because now you're in camps. Are you pro-vax or are you anti-vax? And this might be like a more uniquely American thing, because anti-vax sentiment has grown over the years because of the internet. But it's hard to, when there's so much momentum in one direction, it's hard to reverse course. And that's kind of like what we're experiencing right now, runaway polarization in the United States, where everything makes the situation worse. And I don't know what is going to change that, if it can be changed. but it is certainly alarming, right? Because I don't know where this is headed. At some point there's going to be some consequence of this level of sustained polarization. I think that it has a lot of negative implications for the future of democracy in the United States. If now even something as simple as like election integrity is polarized, where you have Republicans saying, "Oh, the election was stolen," they presented no evidence, but things like that, it worries me. So I'm not. I don't know. I feel a little bit worried because of polarization. I don't think that I feel like this is the worst time for all of the things that are happening to happen. Like, we have a limited window of opportunity to act when it comes to climate change. And yet, we have the craziest politicians in America. 10 years ago, I thought Sarah Palin there's nobody that's going to surpass her in terms of craziness. And now, with Donald Trump being president, with Marjorie Greene and Lauren Boebert in Congress, I think back about, wow, Sarah Palin was actually one of the sane ones. So how long until I look back at this moment and think Marjorie Greene was one of the sane ones? Like, it keeps escalating and it's worrying. So the moment is really frustrating because right now we should be seeing the opposite if we want to have a chance at actually being a leader in climate change or one of the world's leaders in climate change. But then we get hit with a global pandemic and capitalism is really ravaging communities in the United States and around the globe. So it's easy to feel hopeless and it's easy to get bogged down by misinformation because people, they know that things are bad, but they don't necessarily know why. So a meme, the internet will give them an explanation, and whatever gives them the explanation that they're looking for, that's kind of what they stick with. So it's a really complicated time.
I'm going to touch upon the just world hypothesis because I think it really plays into what you just mentioned there about, why do people go in certain directions when in a time of crisis. But the other thing I wanted to mention first was my hope was that eventually everyone on the internet would get exhausted with exerting all this energy at each other, like fighting each other, and would go, this is such a waste of time. We need to find commonality. Now that point might come later down the line, but as you say, the window of opportunity with all these crises isn't a good window of opportunity. And the pandemic has depressed me a lot because not just in terms of people in the general public have reacted, but our leaders leading and yeah. If they're not able to deal with a crisis where it's there in front of you, yes, the pandemic in some ways is invisible because you don't see it, you just see the effect of it. How are we ever going to deal with climate change, which when we start seeing the worst of it, it will already be too late to act because there's a massive lag time. And the lag time with the COVID was a lot shorter. I mean, I remember when it first started coming into the UK and I was seeing people saying, oh, it's going to be just a couple of weeks. And I was like, you have no idea. And then our Prime Minister was saying at a briefing where he was flanked either side by some advisors. And he said something along the lines of I went to a hospital, people had COVID, and I shook everyone's hands, it's fine. And he sort of turned to him and he's like, yeah, but everyone should wash their hands. And I was just like, you are such an idiot. And, when the pandemic got worse, one of the rare times I was using Facebook, I was just sort of saying, how is this guy even leading? And then I would have people that I knew defending him going, oh, it's easy for you to say that in hindsight. And it's like, no, hindsight is like changing your approach with new information. At the time, I didn't have experts telling me about the pandemic, but I just knew it was just obvious from what we were hearing that going into a hospital and shaking everyone's hands was a really stupid idea. And so it makes me very depressed about how we're then going to deal with climate change. But the just world hypothesis is, do you know? Have you heard of it, or do you know of it? Probably with political science.
I've not heard of it.
I know. So I think it's also known as just world theory, but it's the notion that when humans are faced with adversity or intense tragedy, we are always going to try and justify it because that allows us to cope with reality, because dealing with reality for what it is far too painful. And so the famous story I always heard in the context of the Just World hypothesis was after the Second World War, when German soldiers were taken round areas of Germany by American soldiers, and they were taken to like the camps and shown it. There was a German soldier that had said, what did these people do to deserve this? As in, what did the Jews do to deserve this? And it was a genuine question. But that was the Just World hypothesis, which is, when something as outrageous as the Holocaust took place, surely that couldn't have just happened for being an evil act. It must have been in retaliation. Like, it would be too painful to accept that. It may have not been a German soldier who'd asked that question, but it was like in the context of when Germans were being shown around. And you find that happens with all conversations today, that when there is a virus killing so many people, that's kind of a scary thing to deal with. And so it's a lot easier to think, and it's probably a subconscious thing, it's probably not real. It's probably not as bad. The hospitals must be empty because it's a hoax, not because the fact that they've actually closed off the COVID areas because it's an incredibly contagious disease. And you see this in all politics, that when really horrible things happen, and when terrible policy occurs, people justify it, and it's not done out of hatred or malice. It's done because people would hate to accept that bad stuff happened to undeserved people, and that is the end of the story. I mean, look at the great example actually, big issue in the US, the shootings of unarmed black men by the police. What's the first thing that's always gone to? Well, why was he pulled over in the first place? What was his history? Surely you're already looking for things to explain it. Now, you could argue that sometimes it's done the other way, which is straight away, which is, shouldn't have been shot. It's all the police officers' fault. And as I'm saying this, I'm not talking about any specific example, but there's an argument to be made that sometimes it can be gone the other way, when in fact it's, let's actually look at what happened and then decide based on the evidence. However, in the overall picture, of course, too many unarmed black men are being killed by police. Policing in America is another terrifying thing for me as a UK citizen. Some of our police do have weaponry, but there is lots of footage that you can see on YouTube of our police officers using wheelie bins to and trash cans to like push a troubled individual that's wielding a machete and using tasers to take him down. And you know, that's how they do it, as opposed to pulling out a gun and shooting him. It's quite a contrasting thing. But yeah, the Just World hypothesis, I really do feel that plays into a lot of what we do, because there is a lot of pain in the world. And actually, when I talk about the quest for global empathy, it is this idea that I want us to be globally conscious, beyond nation states, beyond beliefs and tribes and, you know, blood ties. But I always acknowledge that in a theoretical or philosophical discussion, if we were to be truly empathetic with the world, like completely connected, we wouldn't survive as human beings, because the world has too much pain on it for us to even comprehend. And I'm sure you've had many examples where you might be looking through a certain news story. I think of times when I talked on Twitter about Syria, and I had photos sent to me of stuff that I can't get out of my head now. Like, as we are doing this podcast right now and people are listening or watching it, there is the most outrageous pain and suffering happening in this planet that we couldn't even imagine. And so as human beings, there is this kind of balancing act of pain and empathy thresholds, because we need to be useful, we need to be able to improve society, but we also do have these mechanisms which do lead to the Just World hypothesis, which are actually there to protect us.
Yeah, I actually think that there's some scientific studies on psychology that kind of validate the Just World hypothesis to an extent, if I'm understanding it correctly, to where people will they'll see or they'll respond to tragedy differently based on the numbers. So you would think like 1 million deaths, the thought of that would be just unbearable for a human being, but they actually respond more to one death or two death. Like that actually triggers a more intense emotional response because, to a certain point, you kind of tune it out. And we have to as human beings, like with all the pain and suffering. I don't think we would be able to function ever if we were truly always thinking about all of the terrible things that's going on in the world, wars, starvations. It'd be too much. But yeah, I totally agree with the premise that people, they don't believe that they're doing wrong, or very few people actually think that they're doing wrong. Like, I think that there's very few people who actually do evil and think, yes, I'm evil, I'm the villain, I love this. I think they believe that they are justified in what they're doing. Um, and maybe there's some exceptions. I think of politicians maybe as the exceptions because a lot of them operate as if they're sociopaths, but that's a different story. But like, with going back to the pandemic, the reason why I find it so traumatic is because I kind of looked at the pandemic as a test run for how we'd respond to climate change. If we can
Agreed.
conquer this pandemic, we can take on something, or maybe we'd be able to take on something that's orders of magnitudes worse. But because we failed so miserably for something that isn't as complicated as global climate change, it does kind of feel, a little bit frustrating. And so I think that, like, the reasons why we failed the pandemic, it's not necessarily because people are they're on the side of the pandemic, and sometimes all facetiously say, hey, this person must be pro plague because of the way that they're acting, anti-mask, anti-vaccine. But in actuality, like, I don't literally mean that. I think that if you zero in and look at their brain and could find out what they're thinking, it would be, no, I'm doing the good thing. I'm the one who's saving people. I'm the one who's doing good in the world, which is preposterous because, I mean, during a pandemic, you would think that somebody who's against masks, there's no way, common sense wouldn't allow someone with two brain cells to rub together to think that that's like the good, noble thing. But they genuinely believe that they are good, as flawed as their thinking may be. They genuinely believe that the masks during a pandemic are somehow more harmful because perhaps normality is better than, or that the image of normality is preferable than, like, everyone wearing masks during a pandemic to save lives. It's I think that the just humanity hypothesis makes a lot of sense to, like, use that to try to understand people's thinking. Not that we can ever perfectly figure out what people are thinking. We don't know what makes people tick. But yeah, I don't think that, like, even going back to the YouTubers, the ones who are very, very, like, clickbaity, the drama centric channels, I think that they tell themselves that what they're doing is noble by covering this drama. It's a way of informing people in a roundabout way. And it's not just clickbait, hot air, sensationalist bullshit. Like, what they're doing does have some noble good. I think that one thing about human beings, is that I feel like we all, to an extent, have main character syndrome, where we feel like we're like the stars of this movie that we're in, and
We're
the movie
player
is
one.
our life. We're player one, exactly. And, we feel like, there's going to be a beginning, a middle, there's going to be a climax and an ending. And so, trying to deprogram yourself from that thinking and acknowledge that we're all just, we're we're not even side characters, we're extras, we're not that important on a global scale. Even though each individual life is important, but we're not like the main characters. We're not going to be the saviors of the world, and we're not the villains of the world. We just exist at this point in time. Like, trying to reprogram ourselves and change the way that we think, I mean, maybe that will be conducive to change, but I'm not sure, honestly, because I feel like anything that I thought before these last couple of years had, it's gotten me to reevaluate my thinking and the way that human beings operate. Because I was very, when I started my podcast, I was very optimistic. I felt like all you have to do is educate people, and they'll immediately be convinced by a good argument and enough statistics and facts. That's not necessarily the case. Like, before, I thought, you know what, this current crop of politicians, the Republican Party is awful, but we just have to wait because the next generation of Republicans will be better. Not necessarily, because, even if we look at younger generations now and they look really egalitarian, socially progressive, people change. circumstances change, propaganda is powerful. So it's, I think that I've become a little bit more of a doomer. And that's one way to frame it. But in a way, it's me kind of being, I think, more realistic, which is important because you can't change the world for the better if you don't know how it operates. So acknowledging how flawed people are, myself included, I think is really important if you're going to be doing politics, because you're not going to be able to reach people if you don't know the way that they think.
It was actually one of the first videos I ever did on YouTube in like 2006. It was called "Admit to the World You're Not Perfect," and it was this idea of like flaws. And I do think it is at the heart of building more intellectual honesty, not just in terms of the arguments and the topics we talk about, but the of humans, us, the vehicles of these messages. Because what has always been the case is the idea of it's about being right in everything. Because if you're wrong in anything, although most of us would say, no, being wrong is an opportunity to learn the right way. It's a transition of enlightenment. Being wrong is actually a strength. It has strengths to it. But we live in a world where the most important currency is becoming status as opposed to money, because status does lead to money, especially with social media when it comes to followings and getting the clicks. And so what happens when we see discussions around cancel culture, or when we see drama, it's people get built up, and it's the age-old story with the media. People get built up just so they can be torn down again. Only, unfortunately, sometimes the media builds up people and then can't put the genie back in the bottle, like Donald Trump.
Right.
But that is a big part of it. And I have always tried to be as open as I can about things that I've got right, things I've got wrong. I think in my first episode of this podcast, I was chatting with my friend Hamza Ashar, who's a comedian, and I was saying about how when I was in primary school, we call it primary school here, I know you call it elementary school, I spoke about how I told racist jokes in the playground, and it wasn't because I was thinking it was a way of hurting people. I did it because it got laughs, and that was rewarding me for certain behaviour. And it was only when I told a joke to someone whose race was the subject of the joke and I saw that he was distraught that I felt mortified, and empathy was kicking in, and it made me reflect. And it was an important lesson. I wish I could have had that lesson not via someone suffering, but by talking about it, the response I got from people who said, I used to tell jokes like that and I felt bad. And instead of like being hidden about it, they now speak openly about it, because that's an important part of development, is not just about where we were, but it's like, what were the stepping stones to get out of it? And so I always talk about the fact that, if I was lost in a forest in complete darkness, I'd hope someone would be out there looking for me to show me how to get out of it. And there is this courage is contagious element to the fact that by being honest about when we've been wrong and when we've made mistakes, we actually take the power away from the risks of things like cancel culture and that, because as more people are open, it sort of mitigates, it spreads out the risk. It's like, then everyone's like, well, yeah, we all made mistakes. But because we live in a society where no one wants to, talk about the mistakes they've made, only point out the mistakes of others, it's all the deflection game, there isn't this honest conversation. And I do think that that is a really important thing that we need to work on. And I think it's hopefully going to get better over time. But you also mentioned kind of the aspect around ego and, the whole, are we player one? Are we in the role in the movie? I'm curious to know, because I've definitely had ego issues throughout my life. It's stuff that I've had to keep in check. Ego does play an important role. But as I've got more into mindfulness and meditation, it's been a really humbling experience to sort of flatten the ego and not let it be a driving force. I was curious to know, what do you do to keep your ego in check? And you might go, well, I have no ego. But with the stuff that you do, like, do you have any rituals and stuff?
Well, look, anyone who says that they don't have an ego is lying. I mean, I have a YouTube channel. So to have a YouTube channel, there has to be at least a bare minimum amount of ego there, right? To put yourself
Correct.
on camera and talk. So, I mean, things that I do is just I remind myself that I'm human, and messing up sometimes is a perfectly normal part of the human experience. It doesn't matter how accomplished you want to feel. It doesn't matter how intelligent you want to believe you are. If you are a human being, you will mess up. That is inextricably linked to our experiences on this planet. So for me, just reminding myself that it's okay to mess up once in a while and admit it, that's actually really important, because like me admitting if I was wrong, because I cover politics on my show. So oftentimes, my views are going to fluctuate depending on what's really in the news. Over time, if you map up, my political ideology, it's going to go from here to here probably based on like the things that I see. Nobody is perfectly consistent. Nobody is going to be right 100% of the time. So I think that getting people to acknowledge that by myself, trying to be humble and admit when I was wrong or admit my deficiencies, I think that that is important, because it gets people to kind of like subconsciously think, oh, I guess that's true. I guess I was wrong about this one thing. And that's like the one thing that we can maybe use to break polarization and like bring the world together. Because the thing about social media, to kind of go back around here, is like a lot of personalities, they benefit from being very ego driven and proving how right they were and bragging about how right they were. And I've done it sometimes where I'm like, hey, remember this thing that I said? And I'd play a 30-second clip. Hey,
Yeah.
turns out I was correct about that. We all do that to an extent. And the reason why it's rewarded on media like YouTube, on Facebook, on
The
Twitter is
status
because
economy.
people,
That's it.
yeah, yeah. People are drawn to leaders. So confidence usually is assumed to be, leadership quality. So, there's this incentive to be really egotistical online. And if you're really confident and you talk about how you're never ever 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 wrong, people are going to gravitate towards you, because there's something admirable about somebody who's so confident. But at the end of the day, I think that we're fooling ourselves to think that we're all right 100% of the time, or sometimes we aren't flawed in the way that we think. I think that trying to reinforce this over and over and over and over again, it's like a training exercise, right? Like for me, like I feel like if I talk about a political subject, healthcare for example, and I admit to people, hey, I kind of misinterpreted one of the details of the Medicare for All bill that Pramila Jayapal, she wrote this bill, and one of the details I got wrong. I think that's really important, because when I tell people in the future about Medicare for All and I try to explain the provisions, sometimes on the left we'll get into like really weird battles about like provisions of bills, and it gets ugly sometimes. But like if people know that I'm coming at them from a place of like honesty and trying to give them the information as I know it, I think that helps to build trust. It builds relationships, and it's important. Like ego is not going to be something that we go away, but trying to do our best to like put caps on it is really important. And my whole like my secret is just constantly reminding yourself you're going to be wrong sometimes. And even if, society wants you to believe that it's a weakness to admit fault, it's not actually. It's just part of the human experience. Like none of us are superheroes as much as we want to be. We're all just flawed human beings trying to navigate this world for the limited amount of time that we're on it. And it's okay to admit that we're wrong. In fact, I think it's really, I feel inspired by people who say, hey, this thing that I said was really wrong. Because we've all been there. And, even if you live to be 150 years old, which nobody will, but even if you are, on your very last day, you're not going to have learned everything that there is to learn about this world and human beings. So, you do what you can and admit that, sometimes you're going to mess up. It's part of the process, it's part of living.
They say actually the first person to live to 200 years old has already been born. But
I've heard that.
I don't know if I'd want to be that person.
I definitely do not.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems to be there are two parts. There's probably more, but for the sake of this conversation, there are sort of two paths when building an online persona. One is, as you say, integrity, which is sort of the long game of admitting when you're wrong, and it means that when things do slip up, people can then say, but look, he's always been intellectually honest about, when he's got things wrong, and will always be upfront with us. But on the other side, there are people that will, I'm always right, and when they're wrong, they've built this audience, they have to double down, and it's why they double down, and it creates a personality where they're never going to, they're just going to keep stacking the cards up. And it means that, I think it's what leads to extremities, because it means it gets to a point where they can't possibly admit they're wrong. Oh, Donald Trump is a great example of that. He is someone that will just never, and you become a part of your own delusionment, because you've sort of created this, and then you have yes men around you that are supporting you that way. So that definitely plays into it. One aspect of dealing with ego, this is going to sound quite Joe Rogan now, but have you ever tried a flotation tank?
I want to. I feel like it would give me anxiety, but I kind of want to try it.
Dude, honestly, I miss going to them, and I'm probably going to try and go to one soon. It's one of the best things I ever did in my life. I knew about them for years, and for people that don't know what a flotation tank is, it is this spaceship pod looking thing, and you basically get your own room, you have a quick shower, you open the pod up, and inside it is water that is body temperature. So when you get into it, you can't really feel it against your skin because it's the same temperature as you. It's got 1/2 ton of Epsom salt in it, which means you're weightless, so you don't feel gravity, and you just lie in it. You go in naked, so you're not even feeling like clothes and that. All you feel is the water, but then you don't even feel the water after a while. You close the pod on top of you. There are lights in there, nice blues and greens, and they can play music at the beginning or all the way through. I always have it at the start for like 10 minutes, turn the light off, and then you just lie there, and it's for about an hour, and then the music turns on and you get out. And because you disconnect from your body, it's pitch black, you've got earplugs in, you can't really hear anything, you're lying in the water, totally weightless. It's body temperature. You don't feel your body. The only thing you feel is your mind. And I think that one of the best times to do it is your first time, because you go in with no expectation. You don't know what to expect, and every time you do it, it's kind of different. And I'm going to say about 20 minutes in, how do I know? Time perception goes out the window. But when I first went in there, it did feel like for the first 20 minutes, I'm wasting my time because my mind will not shut up. And it's because when you switch off all the stimuli, all the visuals, all the sound, all the feeling, your brain is just like firing, because it's just like, people forget how busy our brains are. Like, I'll be watching something on TV while doing something on my phone, like multitasking. Like, your brains are so busy. But then there's this moment where it kind of, your brain just goes, all right, I give up. And you just start having a conversation with yourself. And whether I've had anxiety or I've had a bad back, it has always sorted me out. And when your time's up, you kind of feel like Neo from the Matrix when he comes out of that thing, in the goop. You sort of crawl out and just like a newly born. And I've always been asked if I work for the flotation tank people, because I talk about it so much. But I'm like, no, it's just something that was so life-changing to me. I want everyone to experience it. And there's not one person that I've recommended it to who's done it that has said they disliked it. I think the least enthusiastic reaction I had, I think it was from my mum, which was, I really liked it, probably wouldn't do it again, but that's fine. But yeah, I just highly recommend it, because it's just...
You've actually convinced me now. Like, I really want to try it. I'm very claustrophobic, so that's why I always just kind of instinctively thought, but I'm reading a book called Recursion right now that has a lot about sensory deprivation. It's how they kind of do like time traveling stuff. Well, I don't want to spoil it if anybody wants to read it, but it's got me thinking about like sensory deprivation and like, how would I react? And my instinct is, I'd probably be claustrophobic. But the way you describe it is actually, it would be interesting.
Well, the thing I always tell people, because it's that obviously different companies do it in different areas, but the ones that I've always seen, they have an FAQ section. And some of the ones that I've been to, they have people with like post-traumatic stress disorder who use it. And I'm just like, is that really what you'd want to go into? But they do, like, the people that work at these places, they're not going to want you to go in there. They're not going to lie to you if you've got claustrophobia and say, do it, you'll be fine. But they genuinely say people with claustrophobia are usually fine with it. Obviously, there'll be some cases, but you can have the pod open the whole time. But it's weird because I'm someone who, as a kid, when I saw like the movie Jaws, I couldn't go in swimming pools because I had this idea of like when I was doing backstroke of there being a great white underneath me in the water. And so when I was in these flotation tanks in pitch black and I'm just floating in water, there was a few moments where I was like, don't think about the stuff you thought as a kid. And I'm thinking about it. There could be a massive void of sharks underneath me. Your mind sometimes wonders, but like the music and it's just... it is just amazing. And I would say, like with all these things, if you do have concerns, just speak to the people there, because they will, at the end of the day, they don't want people banging, get me out. You do have it. You have two buttons. Well, obviously it depends on the build, but I think a lot of the flotation tanks, they have two buttons on the inside. They have one which is for the light on and off, and then they have one which is like the alarm, like if there is something that happens. But there was an elderly gentleman that because a lot of these places, they have a nice chill out room after, where you have nice teas and nice books to read, or a guest book where people write about their experiences, which is always really interesting to read. And there was this elderly gentleman, I think he must have been in his 60s, and he says he goes every 2 weeks because he has a really bad neck, and he says the first 10 minutes he gets spasms and like jolts, but then it fixes him for a couple of weeks. And I went in once when I had pain in the small of my back and I really struggled to walk around like normally, and it totally fixed me. Because when you're lying because you're lying in water that is supporting you, you can get, some of them have a little float in it to support your head, but you just let your head back. But what I always find every time you go in is I don't lean back far enough, because you're not used to letting, you normally be on a pillow, but to go in the water, you can go a bit deeper. And I don't think I've ever been in water with that, like, you know, you hear about the Dead Sea and stuff like that, where there's a lot of salt and you float. But I think it's the first time I've ever been in water with that much buoyancy, and it's just... yeah, so really cool. And your hair feels amazing afterwards because it's all the magnesium and the Epsom salt. Your skin feels amazing. And yeah, a lot of the times I'll be like zen-like for a good couple of like 1 or 2 days. And I've had people comment on it saying, you seem really like, not spaced out, but just like very confident, like quiet confidence to you. But there was a few times where I always worry when I'm driving home, like not putting on heavy metal music, or like I don't want to undo this good. But I once came home and I put on my PlayStation and I played a bit of Fortnite, and I played the best I've ever played. And for a game that's that active, and I think it is just because it hones you in. And what I found out was there are a lot of sports people that use flotation tanks either as a part of recovery or as a part of improving their concentration and, you know, just reflecting on things and getting your head in the right space. So, yeah.
Wow. Okay, I'm going to look one up, and if I find one, I will let you know what my experience is. I don't know if there's any like near me, but now it sounds
Whereabouts
cool
are you
to
based?
just like... So I'm in Portland, Oregon. So
Okay.
there's usually everything. I might have to drive a little bit to it, but I'm curious because it sounds just like a really good thing to like recenter yourself, which I think is really difficult to do. But if it kind of like helps you and assists you in just like resetting your mind, I think that'd be really, really therapeutic. Interesting. I've never considered doing one of these. Now you got me sold. Do you work for them, Myles? Do you work for the flotation?
Am I a part of Big Float? Big Float?
Big Float, yep.
The flotation industrial complex taking its stand. Look at all these. We got these all in Portland. We got everything from Enzo Float, Floatwell, Float On, The Float Shot. I love these names. Float North, Urban Float. Oh, that's in Vancouver. Oh, yeah.
And they have a lot of good stars, too. Like, pretty high ratings, it looks like.
Yeah, Aquafloat. Oh, man. These are...
Okay.
I keep forgetting how close it is to... Is that Vancouver, Canada?
Yeah, no. It's so Portland is like really, really close. Like where I lived as a kid, Vancouver was like 15 minutes away.
But that's not Oh, so there's a Vancouver in Portland.
Yeah, so there's a Vancouver in Washington State, actually.
This is it. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Okay, I was getting confused then because I was
Yeah,
like, I didn't think it was that close to the border because
yeah, yeah.
I have cousins in Vancouver, Canada, and
Oh,
actually,
okay.
uh, many years ago, like over 10 years ago, my ex, she was from Seattle, and when I flew
Oh,
out to see her, it was when I was 20. Um, and I think she was 19, so we couldn't drink legally, and we wanted to do something for New Year's Eve, so we actually took a road trip over the border. And do you know, it was the most surreal experience because as someone who could drink here, age
mhm.
18, and now I'm 20, so that's been like 2 years in the innings. I then go to America and feeling like, oh, I can't drink again. And I remember the liberation of going over the border going, yay, we can drink. Like, it was such a weird mental mindset, like a mindset to have that, you know, when it comes to laws and like how it impacts you, that doesn't matter where you are on the planet, it's this body drinking alcohol. It was just that in my country I was allowed to do it for 2 years, and then suddenly I wasn't, and then I was again because I was the age. It was a very
That's
surreal
interesting.
experience. But yeah, Vancouver's a beautiful place, and I love Washington State. I've
Yeah.
been to quite a lot of places in the US, all around the outside. But you were telling me, I think before the show, that you haven't got a passport, so you've never. Have you ever been
Never
abroad?
left.
You've never left.
Never. Never. And part of it does stem from like my claustrophobia. So getting in a plane would actually probably be something that I need some Xanax for. I'd have to see a doctor beforehand. But no, I really want to. I was like in a couple of years ago, I was really like getting this itch to travel because I never really did it before. Like I've been all along the West Coast in the U.S., but that's it. I haven't really even explored my own country. And I had like this really itch to travel. Like, I really wanted to go and see the world. But it kind of just went away, and I'm like, eh. But I mean, at some point in time, it's gonna come back. You know, probably when the pandemic is over, because I don't want to do much now. But yeah, yeah, it'd be really cool to like just see this marble that we're all living on. Like I talk about like admiration for like uh the planet and people, but yet I haven't really gone anywhere. Part of that stems from like a lot of my issues with like claustrophobia and agoraphobia and anxiety. But I mean, I think that, you know, there'll come a time where I will travel, and I'll love it, and I'll wish I did it sooner. I feel like that's me being like the main character in my story, thinking that, you know, there's going to be this arc in my life where, you know, I go through all this traveling and I'm like, you know, backpacking through Europe. I don't know.
No,
Not going
it's
to
good.
happen, but
It's good to have a like, you know, foresight and to vision things to aim for. I mean, I'm hopeful that we'll get to a point where we have just these super bullet trains that go over the ocean or through it,
that'd
and
be cool.
so we don't have to fly. Because yeah, flying. I mean, I flew so much with my family growing up, and then I think it was like in my late teens I then started going through that sort of existential dread, and then I started getting quite. I think it must have been after seeing Final Destination, the movie, like flying freaked me out. And
Yeah.
have you seen the original Final Destination? Yeah.
That absolutely freaked me out.
So
100%. That probably scarred our entire generation.
dude, so I was going to a friend's birthday party and I knew nothing about the movie and I was running late and I turn up to the cinema and they're like, it's Final Destination. I sit in the cinema and it's that opening scene where like the cockpit blows up and
No.
in with surround sound in cinema, dude, that scared the hell out of me. It was like I never saw the follow-ups, but yeah, that one really stuck with me. But yeah, I used to then have to always drink red wine, but so I could sleep well because I could never sleep on planes. But the problem is, especially with long flights to the US, if it was a 12-hour flight to your part, if you drink red wine and then you wake up midway through the flight, dehydration. Oh man, that's a horrible thing to
Oh,
deal with. And it's also the psychology of like when you're halfway on the journey, 6 hours in, there's no getting off. Like it's like you are
right.
now here. You know, there is just ocean. There is nothing else, and it is really bizarre because even like when it comes to fear of heights, like when I'm on tall buildings, I don't like it at all.
Hmm.
And then, but flying, you look out the window. I think it's what you were talking about earlier about the whole difference when humans try and deal with like a million people versus a few and how you connect with
Mm-hmm.
it. I find that when it comes to public speaking, or if you're performing music, if you're speaking to a small room of people, like 10, 20 people, I think that in many ways could be a lot more difficult than speaking to a room of a few hundred, because when it's to a small amount, you see, you relate, you connect. And it's the kind of the same with heights. When you're on the top of a building and you're looking down, you can kind of say, I can see where I'd fall. Whereas when you're up in the sky, it's just like a canvas. And it looks very surreal being up in the clouds. So I'm sure that's something to do with it. But I haven't traveled as much as I'd like to. The last time I was in the US was 1 or 2 days after Trump got elected. Yeah, that was. So I was in New York City. That was interesting being there.
I bet.
Yeah, and I miss. I do want to get back to the States, but I would say to you that if the time ever comes, you ever come to the UK, dude, you can always crash here. I can show you around.
I will.
Like, I always love where I live more when I have people from abroad visit, because their enthusiasm for the place rubs off on me. Because I live west of London. It's about a 30-minute train ride, so I've got sort of the best of both worlds. I've got nice lakes, and it's interesting because I'm sort of in the country, but then I could get to a town within like 10 minutes, because I always say like the UK feels like a toy town version of the US, because I could get from the very south to the very north of England in like an 8-hour drive, whereas in the US you'd barely make it across a state in many circumstances. And so everything is obviously a lot smaller. But like when I go into London and I show friends, especially from the States, they'll point at stuff and go, oh, that's really cool. And I'm like, you know what it is? I never thought of that before. And one thing I always like to tell my American friends is that we have a toy store in London that is older than the United States of America. I mean, I don't know what kind of toys they were selling back then, but it's called, I was going to call it, I get confused between, there's one called Harrods and there's one called Hamleys, right? Harrods is a department store. Hamleys,
and it's still operational? Like, it's still a store you can buy toys in? No kidding.
The finest toy store in the world. So, I remember going as a kid.
That would be incredible.
Oh man, it was so good. It was like, it's a dream place to go.
Oh, look at that.
Have they got Hamley's history? Here we go. So, in fact, the Hamley story began in Cornwall, England. Okay, William dreamed of opening a toy shop, and in 1760 he did just that. Little did he know it would become the finest toy shop in the world. With humble beginnings as Noah's Ark in 1760, by 1837 Hamley's was already a famous London landmark. Yeah. So yeah, 1760 it was found. That's cool. So yeah, that's a cool thing to visit. But yeah. And if by then you haven't been in a flotation tank, we'll take you to one of them as well.
There we go. Yeah, I'll experience all these things that I've wanted to for a while, just in like a week.
Yeah. What is your impression? I'm always fascinated with this. What is your impression of like the UK or like British people? And you can touch upon stereotypes and stuff like that. I mean, it could be in terms of like the politics and stuff like that, but
I kind of had this like, I don't know, almost like romantic view of like the UK, where it's like everyone there is super smart, super kind. There's like a lot of really lovely old people there that like want to be your grandparents. I also watched like the Great British Bake Off, and I love it. So it's like, I love it. So it's like there's this rich like culture of like different foods and bakeries. So I have that. Also, there's this like level of confusion at some things that I still haven't clarified, that you'll have to help me out. Like, so we call it cookie here, but is a biscuit a cookie? That's one thing that is still confusing. I mean, even though I watched the British Bake Off.
Yeah, I mean, a cookie is a type of biscuit, but yeah, we have like cookies would be like what a chocolate chip is, but yeah, but it's like chips and crisps. What you call chips, we call crisps, and what we call chips, you would call fries. Okay. Yeah.
See, I love all these little things. So I've always loved the UK. I basically grew up as like a Spice Girls super fan, and I wanted to live in London. I loved everything about the culture. I thought that the flag looked cool. So I've always had like this vision of the UK in my mind, that was like, man, it's just like a really cool place. The people there aren't stupid like those of us in the United States. Like, you know, my vision of the US is kind of like colored by the people around me, where it's like they're loud, they're obnoxious. Whereas in the UK, it's just, you know, more quiet people. So that's probably more stereotypical because every country has their idiots and their lovely people. But yeah, I've always had like this really like, I've always hyped up the UK in my mind. So I feel like if I ever see it in person, I've had, you know, the expectations are so high that it'd be hard to meet that expectation in reality when I see it. But yeah, I've had a really good view of just like UK people, like the UK, it's just the coolest.
I like that your description is actually a flip side of what I said quite near the start about wanting to go to America, and because I like the optimism and sort of how sociable people are. You said loud and obnoxious. And then on the flip side, I said here people are a lot more closed off and keep to themselves. And you're like, and over here we're quiet and polite. So, you know, there are good and bad to all these things.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that is really interesting. Yeah, I've just always loved the diversity in America, like all the different states. I've always said I wouldn't know where to move in the US if I was to move out there. But once you're over the ocean, getting around is a lot more straightforward.
Yeah.
My parents, my dad got a job in Boston they were there for 3 years, and Boston I liked, but it was my least favorite place so far I've been to in the US because it was very European, and I go to America for the difference. So actually one of my favorite places was Texas. And
oh, really?
I went to Amarillo, Texas the first time and had an absolute blast. But I tell you what, I'm surprised I didn't get into more trouble because I got taken to a rodeo, and we were literally sat on the back of this open truck with these people that were there that didn't know me. And they were always like saying, "Oh, can you say baked potato?" And I'd say potato, and they'd find it was the best thing ever. But also, I was cheering when the horses kicked the cowboys off. And they were like, "Why are you cheering that?" And I went, "Because the horses are doing it against their will, and I like to see the underdog get back." And I think only because I was British, I didn't get my lights punched out. So,
that is awesome.
Yeah.
Okay, here's one thing that I want to ask you. So, in the United States, whenever we see like a British person, and my family has a close friend who's British, but like it's always like, oh, that person's accent is so cool. Like every single person I know loves the British accent. So when there are Americans in the UK, is it the same thing? Where it's like, oh, that accent is really cool. Like how is that perception? That's one thing that I'm curious about.
Okay, so I personally love American accents. I mean, I love accents overall. I think it's why, well, my ex was from the States. The accent was definitely playing a part of it. But what I would say is, this is relevant. When I was on a school trip in Germany and I got taken on a tour around castles, the German tour guide spoke with an American accent or American-esque accent. And I soon realised it's because around the world, the English language is predominantly learned via TV. I mean, this was before the internet, and most TV is Hollywood, it's American shows and things like that. And so in the UK, we're very accustomed to the American accent. And so, yeah, I think there are people that like it, but it definitely doesn't have the impact like when I've been in the States. It's been absolutely ridiculous, like, especially in the early days of YouTube. Yeah, in the early days of YouTube, when I used to go to VidCon in like Anaheim, California, and speak there, I'd go out for grabbing lunch in a supermarket, and I would have girls I could only dream of saying how much they love my accent, and I had the confidence to ask if they wanted to get coffee, which I would never do in the UK. I would never have the confidence, but over there, I feel like I'm in a movie now, so I feel like I could do this. But over the years, there's been a saturation in people with British accents. I mean, like the amount of British actors and actresses that go over there and put on American accents to be like, Rick Grimes in The Walking Dead by Andrew Lincoln. Like, you know, lots of examples of that. So,
Idris Elba too. I had no idea he was actually British. I'm like,
right.
wait, his American accent is better than mine.
And that's what I've always wondered was, do Americans go, yeah, it doesn't quite work? So yeah, it's interesting that they've nailed it. So I remember in the early days of YouTube, I always wanted to do videos about like comparing the accents, like, and then everyone did them, and I was like, I was such an idiot to stall on those ideas, because back then it was a much more of a novelty. So yeah, I mean, personally, I love the American accents, but I think because American culture is so predominant in the media, we're so used to it. And actually, the other week, I was a guest host on this PlayStation VR channel, PSVR Without Parole, and there were people in the chat, because the other hosts were American. There were people in the chat who heard me speak before, and I think some of them were from the UK, and they were like, I never knew how distinct Myles's British accent was until it was in a situation with American speakers. And for me, that was when I first realised what it was to have a British accent, was when I was watching a sitcom growing up, and it was an American sitcom. I can't remember what it was, and there was a British actress on it. And when she started speaking, I was like, wow, that sounds really like jarring. But the thing you also mentioned about like British being like smart and proper, there's a really interesting sort of cultural aspect to that, which is in a lot of movies, whether it's like the evil scientist, or, you know, the scientist that works in the lab on the zombie virus and it gets out, or says, no, we should just do this, always British or Russian. And there is something to do with empire. Like, it's a cultural thing of like, to do with, you know, the UK used to own America, and, you know, there is that kind of cultural rivalry. I mean, so I do think that comes to play as well. So, and also the subtle differences we were talking about, I find absolutely fascinating as well. And it's actually why America was always a place I went to every year, because when you visit another country where they speak a different language, it kind of makes the differences in everything else seem somewhat less remarkable than in America, because you're like, well, of course it's different. They speak a different language, etc. Whereas when I go to America, it's like, we're speaking the same language, and yet look how different it is in terms of whether it's like car parking spaces are massive in stores, or when I was in Texas and got a Whataburger like medium milkshake and it was bigger than my head, like stuff like this. It just blew my mind, and it was like, it's amazing how different our cultures have been. And yeah, I do find that interesting. But yeah, you definitely have to make it over.
Interesting.
And, Portland, I've never been to, but I was in Seattle, yeah, maybe 10, 11 years ago now, and I definitely want to get back out to the States again soon.
Yeah. If you've been to Seattle, it's kind of like Portland is Seattle 2. Like, it's the sequel. Like, they're fairly similar, similar vibes, similar culturally, really, really diverse.
Similar weather,
it's just,
I'm guessing?
It's very similar weather.
It's similar to the UK. Seattle was very similar. So if you're cool with the weather there, you'll be cool with the weather here.
Oh yeah, absolutely. It's like, you know, overcast and whatnot. The one difference that I'll say about Portland compared to Seattle is that Portland kind of is more weird. Like, if you've ever heard of the show Portlandia, it's kind of like a show about how weird people from Portland are. Like, they're still living in the 90s, and, you know, the 2010s. That's when the show came out. We kind of like have a slogan, keep Portland weird, because, you know, everyone knows about the guy who's riding down the street on a tricycle with bagpipes with a Darth Vader helmet. Like, it's like a staple. It's kind of like the naked cowboy in New York. So we have our own weird things. It's kind of like a very hippie vibe, but it's it's pretty like laid back over here. Like, I couldn't imagine myself in any other parts of the country, because like I grew up in Portland, so like I feel like it's ingrained in me. Like, the weirdness of Portland is like inside of me, and, you know, I feel like other people wouldn't understand me if I was in like I don't know, North Carolina or something.
That's funny, man. Oh, dude. I guess the last thing I'll touch upon before we wrap this up, and man, the last 2 hours have absolutely flown by, is
they have.
We've touched upon a lot of big issues. Man, dude, the bouncing around of issues. We've almost fixed the world's problems. Not quite. Maybe if we had another hour.
I feel like we've touched on everything.
Yeah. But when it comes to like big issues, like we've got the pandemic, we've got economic crises looming over us repeatedly, and we've got climate change. With you and the Humanist Report, are you currently just taking things day by day, or do you have a sort of strategy of kind of where your focus points are? Because I'll preface that is going to be the question, but I just want to preface it with this, which is a lot of my videos in the past around activism, although they have been about specific issues, I've always sort of been about the psychology of activism. And one of the key lessons I try and tell people is being compassionate to others and realizing that we're all fighting our own battles. We all have only so much time and energy in the day and so much autonomy to make a change. And the reason I bring it up is someone might have a petition for an issue that you haven't signed, and they go, so you don't care about it. And it's like, well, I just hadn't done it. Or why aren't you talking about this when you're talking about this? Is this one not as important? And I think that really comes back to the idea that we try and promote individualism. And it kind of goes to that thing about the ego, that we can sort of do everything, when actually society is about realizing that we can only do so much individually, and we have to do it with the knowledge that other people are doing other parts of the puzzle as well. And a last little story I'll say is a good friend of mine he works in entertainment as a presenter. When I was explaining something I was doing last year when my freelance work went down, I worked in a factory nearby building respiratory equipment for hospitals. It was just because it was a job, but obviously during the pandemic it was very important, and it was a great experience. And he just messaged me and he said, dude, it's amazing what you're doing. I feel like what I do is just entertainment and not really of much societal value. And I said, whoa, stop there. I said, when I get home from work and I'm feeling low or knackered, I can watch one of your videos and it cheers me up. Like, what you're doing is valuable in society. And, I think that's why often we overlook the arts and we think about just like, what is the most important thing? That's all we should be doing. No, society is about, we all play a role, and we shouldn't always be so cutthroat about if someone is doing one thing, it means they don't care about something else. So I just wanted to make that point to sort of preface it. But when it comes to these big issues, and obviously climate change is number one, but there are a lot of other things that link into it. Like when it comes to the Humanist Report, because the stakes feel so high now, has that changed the trajectory you see your channel on? Has it changed the trajectory on what you see your mission is as a content creator?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, if I'm being honest, I kind of feel like right now, myself as a content creator, I'm kind of going through an identity crisis because things kind of changed rapidly over the course of the last year. So, like, I started my channel at the start of Bernie Sanders' first presidential run. Immediately when that was over, I knew he'd be running again. So it was always like, it felt like I was leading up to this moment to where we have this progressive champion and we start making change. But 2020 changed kind of everything. It kind of like flipped my whole projection of what I thought would happen. I thought I would kind of just be telling the story of the way that we're fixing the country and we're beginning right now, but that changed. So now it's a matter of like, what do I do? What's my role? What's next? And I think that part of it is there doesn't necessarily, what I'm accepting is that there doesn't necessarily have to be a what's next. Like, we don't have to go from chapter to chapter. I kind of feel like I'm storytelling. And over years, when you step back and you look at my videos, I think that they'll kind of tell a story. And so my goal is to basically, like, if we're talking really big picture and long term, like, I want, not that I have this much influence, but I want people to be able to be more savvy. I want them to be more open-minded. I want them to be more nuanced. I want them to learn how to utilize the critical thinking skills that I think everybody has innately. And like with the Humanist Report, ultimately, my goal would be to just get people to be more empathetic, to see the world from not necessarily, a Californian or New Yorker or American perspective, but just from like a human perspective. Like, to my core, I really am a humanist, in that I think that we really, like, we have to stop and it sounds like corny and cliche, but like I don't want us to continue to focus on our divisions. But unfortunately, we kind of have to focus on our divisions. We have to focus on these dividing lines right now because we're kind of like in this weird in between moment, I feel like, in US history where we're seeing political realignment in real time and we don't know what that's going to look like, but it's probably going to look relatively different in 5-10 years from now. So, I mean, in terms of like what I want to do, I just want people to have the ability to be responsible consumers of media and to just do something. My contribution is to help people find their contributions. And so when they hear the problems that I talk about regularly on the program, I don't know what their takeaway is going to be. Maybe they run for Congress. Maybe they run for mayor or city council. Maybe they subvert all of that and they do grassroots activism. Like for me, I just want to find some way to light the spark in people. But it's difficult. You're kind of walking a fine line because when you talk about all these negative things, you can easily have somebody succumb to, doomerism and think, oh, well, all these problems are an issue, so it's not going to be fixed. What's the point? So that's not what I'm trying to accomplish. My goal is to like get people to find their purpose. And you're not going to have a 100% success rate. Like it's not like they're going to watch the Humanist Report and come away thinking, oh, well, I know what my role is. But, it's just a matter of like getting them to think deeper about these issues and think maybe there's something I can do personally. What's my contribution? I matter. I can make a difference, even if it's small scale with my peers, in my community. Just something like encourage people to try to make an effort. And that's really all I can hope for, with the YouTube channel, long term, anyways.
That's amazing. And we are just ripples in water that are influencing and nudging each other. And, I think it's good to have that humble attitude of, we can't be entirely transformational, but actually sometimes the most important part of someone's journey is planting the seeds to then let them find their own way. It kind of goes back to what we were talking earlier about media literacy. It's not about telling people what to think, but getting them on their way to make those discoveries and have autonomy to then make a difference in the world that is hopefully positive. But yeah, everything you do, Mike, is so great. And I was really happy when you I was really happy when you said you were up for coming on this. I knew we were going to have a great transatlantic conversation. And I would obviously urge everyone to check out the Humanist Report because you're doing great work, dude. So thanks for coming on the show.
Well, thank you so much. It's been an absolute blast. Like these past couple of hours, absolutely just like zoomed by. But hey, we've known each other forever, so of course, when we actually talk, of course, it's gonna zoom by. It's always fun to chat with friends.
Absolutely. All right, man. Well, we will definitely organise a trip one way or the other sometime soon.
Yes. Someday it's happening.
Cheers.
Take care.